scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Now, let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News. And greetings from Technocracy News and Trends. Patrick Wood here. Glad to be back in the broadcast saddle again. This last weekend, I was pleased to travel to Memphis, Tennessee, where I gave a message to the Campaign for Liberty group there in Memphis. We had a great time, and I presented on 5G, the Internet of Things, technocracy, and why we're facing an existential threat from this entire 5G instant real-time connection network that's being built. Hopefully within a couple of weeks, I'll be able to reproduce this presentation in the studio, and you'll be one of the first to hear it when I do. It's a very important presentation, and one that I hope that people will share widely. In the meantime, what's in the news today is very insightful. The first article that I posted is titled Penn State, that's Pennsylvania, of course. Forget the Constitution, it's analytics, algorithms, and social credit scoring. My comments explain what the article is all about. Technocracy is already applying undue pressure against the Constitution and the rule of law. Social credit scoring is a personalized tool of behavior modification that obviates the need for external controls. Let me explain a little bit what I mean before I read some of this article. The Constitution and the rule of law are indeed external forces of control on society. It originally intended that it would rule over a moral people that would understand the difference between what is moral and what is immoral, and would generally adhere to the principles of the Constitution and to the rule of law. And if they broke the law, they would be penalized, held to account, perhaps fined or imprisoned or whatever. But this is the culture that we've had for so many years. With the advent of social engineering and technocracy, the whole idea of controlling individuals means that the reins of control are now on the individual directly, not on society as a whole. The net result of this will be that the Constitution and the rule of law will be out the window, and people's behavior will be moderated by algorithms, analytics, and social credit scoring. The article states, AI-driven social scores to supplant Constitution? Professor Larry Backer of Penn State University writes in a 2018 paper that resistance to social credit systems in the West could be dissolved when the masses are socialized as a collective, and the great culture management machinery of Western society develop a narrative in which such activity is neutralized within Western culture. A 2018 paper written by prominent law professor Larry Backer of Penn State discussed ways in which a social credit system could be implemented in the West. Backer writes that the shift in law with this system will, quote, change the focus of public law from the Constitution and rule of law to analytics and algorithm. The paper is titled Next Generation Law, Data-Driven Government and Accountability-Based Regulatory Systems in the West and Social Credit Regimes in China. Backer describes moves to social credit in the West as fractured, but gives guidance on how societal norms could be steadily pushed to accept this system. Backer proposes that the, quote, great culture management machinery of the West normalize the idea of social credit and sharing private data. He wrote in his report, and this is a direct quote, to socialize the masses or even mass democracy as a collective, to embrace this pattern of data disclosures beyond these immediately self-serving closed-loop systems, Would it be possible for the state to develop systems for the enforcement of laws, that is criminal and regulatory, that depends on data intelligence by inducing the masses to serve as positive contributors of data necessary for enforcement or regulation? The answer, in Western liberal democracies, may depend on the ability of the great culture management machinery of Western society, its television, movies, and other related media, to develop a narrative in which such activity is naturalized within Western culture. Close quote. As big tech and artificial intelligence creep further into our lives, a grid of high-tech surveillance has entangled us. As if to pacify resistance, these systems, that is Google Home, Apple Watches, Amazon Alexa, offer convenience in the form of targeted ads, personalized content, and other features. In reality, this system is meant to determine whether or not you will be allowed to function in modern society. The Trump administration is reportedly considering using this surveillance grid to monitor the population for signs of mental illness, triggering authorities to confiscate firearms from so-called dangerous individuals. In 2013, Old Thinker News asked the question, will insurance companies use smart appliances to monitor, quote, unhealthy habits? As this 2013 Wall Street Journal article stated, your insurance company, quote, already knows whether you've been taking your meds, getting your teeth clean, and going for regular medical checkups. Now, some employers or their insurance companies are tracking what staffers eat, where they shop, and how much weight they're putting on, and taking actions to keep them in line, close quote. Artificial intelligence, programmed by power-hungry individuals, is steadily taking over our society. It is already censoring political opinions. It will be making medical, education, and financial decisions. Humans are to be sidelined. The social credit system will be watching you closely for any deviant behavior. If you aren't careful, you will become an outcast. Access to food, transportation, and medical care will simply be denied. This is really an important article for you to read to understand what I'm saying, that the Constitution and the rule of law are not going to be needed in a system of scientific dictatorship. Analytics, algorithms, and social credit scoring will simply do the job of controlling you and keeping you in line with what the program dictates. The next story is back to little Greta Thunberg. The title of this article is Climate Shaming and the Disturbing Cult of Greta Thunberg. And indeed, this 16-year-old girl is developing a cult of personality. I doubt that was her intention personally, but this is what's happened. I wrote at the top of this, despite her ignorance and lack of education, Greta has risen to cult status in the eyes of all who worship the earth, and her public exposure dragnet is drawing in millions more. Her message of climate doom is driving other youngsters into depression and despair, and if anybody is monitoring the suicide rate amongst these people who have involved themselves in this climate cult of doom, I would not be surprised if the rate has gone up recently. The article states that the cult of Greta Thunberg is an extremely disturbing one, and one which marks a new low in the drain circling that Western civilization seems to be bent on. Even if I happen to believe that the naturally occurring gas that each of us breathes out many thousands of times per day, and which plants use for photosynthesis, is going to end up being the death of us, I would still be profoundly disturbed by the use of this girl, who is very clearly mentally unstable, as the poster child for the agenda. This video of her speaking at the UN is a case in point. And that video, by the way, is in this article. You can go and see the video for yourself, as is her statement to the Davos crowd earlier this year, in which she decided to spread her own brand of hopeless misery to all. Quote, adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. Close quote. Causes which are backed up by incontrovertible facts do not need the aid of a slightly unnerving and emotive teenage girls to lead the charge. On the contrary, slightly unnerving and emotive teenage girls might be thought by a rational society to be somewhat of a hindrance to the facts, since they are likely to detract from them and move the issues from the realm of reason and rational discourse to emotion and feelings, which of course is exactly the point and why she is where she is. Until last year or so, it was perfectly possible to hold to the reasonable position that any changes to the global climate are not necessarily the product of human actions without being considered unhinged. Yes, the utterly disingenuous charge of denier was increasingly used to smear those who questioned the claims being made, implying that to hold such a position was akin to denying Nazi genocide against millions of Jewish people. But despite this, and the fact that most of the corporate media tended to treat the claim that humans are responsible for climate change as proven fact, it was still just about possible to dissent without being treated like a pariah and a very wicked person. This situation was clearly intolerable to those who have the most to gain from propagating the claims, which is why, at least so it seems to me, they decided to up the ante by using, and I do mean using, a child to go further their cause. And not just any child, one who has a history of depression and other mental illness, and who is capable of making extraordinary emotional and prophetic appeals to the world. If it were all about facts, there would be no need for such tactics, yet the relentless pushing forward of such a person is clearly intended to close off of any remaining debate, since those who criticize her or her message can now automatically be portrayed as callous, stone-hearted oafs with not an ounce of compassion in them. This is yet more emotive guff. No doubt there are some people who are very nasty to Miss Thunberg, and no doubt she has been subjugated to some vile abuse. There are, after all, many vile people out there who like being vile to others. But it is perfectly possible to oppose her message and perfectly reasonable to resent the fact that she is being exploited in a way to further an agenda pushed by those much higher up the food chain without bearing her any ill or, indeed, being very wicked. Personally, I wish her every blessing and that she will find both hope and happiness. It is, however, worth remembering that it wasn't from the camp of the so-called deniers of facts and reason that the decision was taken to use an emotionally disturbed child to act as a global spokesperson and to make emotional appeals to the world. Rather, it was from those who claimed to have the facts, the proof, and the settled science. Why? If the science really is settled and the facts really are incontrovertible, why do we need to use a vulnerable girl to push the agenda, as has clearly happened? On a personal level, I feel for Miss Thunberg. She will no doubt find out sooner or later that she has been exploited by those whom she thought were her friends, only to find out that they were prepared to drop her as soon as she has served their purpose. She will end up being a question in pub quizzes and Trivial Pursuit in 20 or 30 years. Yes, I believe that the world, public houses, and board games will still all be here. On a societal level, frankly, it all has the rather unpleasant whiff of a deliberate campaign to shame people into silence by the exploitation of a frankly very disturbed child. And the fact that there are people who are prepared to use this sort of emotive tactic to further their agenda is really quite sinister and does not bode well. We are perilously close to becoming a society entirely governed by emotion over reason, with the results being seen in the increasing inability of large swaths of people to even accept the possibility that views other than their own should be allowed. Whether you agree with Ms. Thunberg's message, whether you are skeptical, or whether you reject it outright, her exploitation and the cult that is growing around her ought to greatly disturb you. Lastly, at the United Nations this week, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro schooled the United Nations on the Amazon and on freedom. I included not only the full transcript of his message to the United Nations, but also the video that was taken. It is translated, of course, but his native language is Portuguese. His message was very fearless. My comments at the top: Brazilian President Bolsonaro blistered the United Nations to correct outright falsehoods by rejecting environmentalist hysteria over the Amazon and defending its sovereign right to self-determination. Needless to say, environmental extremists immediately cried foul and claimed that Bolsonaro does not speak for Brazil and that he is purposely destroying the Amazon rainforest. This sounds just like attacks on President Donald Trump in the United States. No matter what he does, he's immediately criticized as being a foil. Well, Bolsonaro further aggravated atheists and worshipers of Mother Earth by quoting John 8:32, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." I'm sure that all the people listening at the United Nations ground their teeth just a little bit to hear the Bible being brought up in their hallowed chambers. I encourage you to read his speech and see what he has to say. Brazil has changed since his election. Even though the Marxist left tried and almost succeeded in assassinating him, he's still here, and he survived. And he's a firebrand, and he's telling it like it is. He's trying to restore the greatness that Brazil once had, and indeed they did. Things are turning around in Brazil. Thanks to his courage and stamina, people are lined up behind him to follow him, and indeed to do the things necessary to set themselves upright again. But in the meantime, the people at the United Nations and all other NGOs that are full of environmental extremists, they hate him, and they'd love to do anything they can to get rid of him or to discredit him or even to force him to resign. I think I have news for those people. You can forget that he's going to resign. Well, I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. Catch you next time.